Hello, this is Grant Swartzwelder with OTA Environmental Solutions, and welcome to another edition of the Oilfield Strong webinar and podcast series. As you know, you can see the webinar on our YouTube channel. Just look for Oilfield Strong, and then under a variety of podcast channels, whichever one you prefer. Very fortunate to have a great speaker, a great person on. Go way back with Ben Shepperd. He's been president of the PBPA since 2006, so quite some time. Has done a phenomenal job of growing that industry association and representing all of its participants. His background, depth of background with working for the House members, Senate members, the Capitol, uh, various state agencies. So he has a wealth of experience in a variety. But I think probably the best thing that shows how politically adept he is that he has a degree from both UT and A&M. So he was smart enough to make sure that he could cover both sides and both sides could be happy. So that tells you what type of a leader and a politician or a knowledgeable person. I won't say politician. You're not a politician, but understand the Texas marketplace. So congratulations on that brilliance there.
Well, thank you, Grant. It always made for interesting arguments with myself on Thanksgiving Day, and we all remember those days of the Texas A&M rivalries, and they've been renewed recently with the Texas has moved to the SEC and baseball coach borrowing and stealing and all that. So
Mm.
um, anyhow, it's interesting. Texas is an interesting place, but there's nowhere more interesting than the oil and gas business, and that's what I've really enjoyed doing the last couple decades.
Yeah, and you do it very well. So one part of that has drawn a lot of attention lately is the use of the ESA, the Endangered Species Act, and how it's been applied into the oil industry. And a very specific example of that is our friend, the Dunes sagebrush lizard, that just got put on that list. So if you would, I'll kind of just start off with a kind of a general, what's happened with that? What and probably very importantly, what is the ramification to the oil industry?
Well, you're right. That is the most recent, but certainly not the only action that U.S. Fish and Wildlife has taken. So, just a quick little history on it. U.S. Fish and Wildlife, I'm sure all of your viewers know, it is an agency underneath the Department of Interior. So that's a federal agency that they also oversee. DOI oversees BLM, Forest Service, quite a few others. Endangered Species Act was written in the early 70s, and I think was a well-intentioned act under the Nixon administration. Um, the first experience I had with the ESA was in about 2008. Um, I got a call on our Midland office there, and uh, my trusty assistant said, "Well, it's Scott Sheffield on the phone." And Scott Sheffield, the real Scott Sheffield, who I did not know at the time. He was the president, CEO of Pioneer Natural Resources up till recently, and so sure enough, spent about 3 hours on the phone with Scott and his lead attorney on for these kind of matters, and he basically gave me a pretty good primer and education on the Endangered Species Act, the ways that it's been being utilized to punish industries, and in our case, oil and gas. And so that was my first exposure. And unfortunately, we've been kind of wrestling with the Fish and Wildlife Service ever since then. And on the DSL, which is a lot easier than saying dunes, sagebrush, lizard.
Yeah.
Um, it is. It's been a real challenge, and an eye-opening experience, frankly. Um, it's a little lizard, for those that don't know, that actually lives and burrows underground, um, primarily in the sand dunes of West Texas and Southeast New Mexico. It likes shinnery oak. The shin oak is all over the place, as you know, and it likes the blowouts that go through from basically Monahans all the way up to the Mescalero up there. And they're really pretty evasive characters. They, like I said, they live underground. They do, of course, come up and forage above ground, but basically, um, there's about 3 million acres of habitat, prime oil and gas habitat, in southeast New Mexico and West Texas. That now, as of the decision from last week, they first proposed to list it back in 2008. Well, in recent times, I think they first proposed it in 1982, but nevertheless, I say what the way this works and the way what we call the overuse or abuse of the Endangered Species Act is the environmental groups. Several have gotten very adept. Environmental Defense Fund, Wild Earth Guardians, and a few others have gotten very adept at using the endangered species um, to file litigation, to file suit against the Department of Interior, forcing them and Fish and Wildlife, forcing them to put various species on the list. And we can talk more about kind of how that process gets abused, but that's how the issue has originated in 1982 and 2008, and then again to all the way to today. Um, it's because of, in other words, the scientists didn't dream this up on their own. The folks in Washington didn't dream this up on their own. They're being encouraged, and unfortunately, you do have, um, career staff that is sympathetic to some of these environmental groups. But the bottom line is, much of this habitat now is under, as of 2 weeks ago, middle of June, um, under federal control with respect to the lizard. In other words, if you want to conduct any kind of surface activity, oil and gas, road building, farming, ranching, wind tower development, solar, anything, telephone wires, anything like that, um, you're prohibited from causing any harm or having what they call a taking of the lizard. In other words, it's not only kill, but you can't harm or harass or otherwise interfere with the life of the DSL, which essentially means you have to go to the federal government to get permitted for your activity, and you have to develop some sort of, you have to go through a Section 10 review and all of this drawn out stuff to be awarded a permit. If you were caught, under a taking violation, there are both civil and criminal penalties that can be charged at individuals and companies. And so effectively, um, it is a tool that can significantly limit, if not prevent, certain activities on the surface.
And what an interesting point you made there. I always thought of it as something that affects the oil and gas industry, but it really affects the whole area from, like you said, road building, anything a city might want to do or a county might want to do, it affects them as well as the oil industry.
The whole schmear, as they
Yeah.
say. And in fact, in our efforts, we've had to, as I mentioned, I had sort of a baptism by fire of this first listing. They did ultimately choose not to list the lizard in 2012, but it was as a result of a number of public-private partnerships that came up with these conservation plans, voluntary conservation plans, which a number of our companies supported and enrolled in, along with um, the permit holders, and there were a couple different plans, so several different permit holders who manage and oversee and verify that certain conditions and activities take place on the landscape. And the farmers and ranchers, landowners, benefit typically from um, mesquite removal, rerouting of roads, taking removing abandoned oil field equipment or different things like that that are deemed healthy for the area.
Well, and that was one thing with the DSL. I think I saw upwards to 85% of the companies had a voluntary enrollment or participation. I knew it was a significant number, but that was not acceptable to the forestry uh, agency.
Grant, that's one of the more frustrating aspects of this. You're correct. In the federal listing and final federal listing proposal, or no longer a proposal, um, but the listing decision, it describes the extraordinary links um, companies, and particularly oil and gas companies, but other types of businesses as well that have entered into um, these conservation agreements. Overall, 85% in the New Mexico side, which is actually about 2/3. Their half is 2/3 of the acreage, to use a Yogi Berra, but it's very close to 100% is already covered by a conservation plan that is 100% subscribed um, and verified, and the activities are relayed back to Fish and Wildlife Service. The um, Texas side is significant, well over 3/4 of the habitat over here. So I guess that's kind of how they get to their 85% average. But the there are at least three plans, conservation different plans that oil and gas operators can avail themselves of. Um, and while the listing is final now, um, we can't. Enrollment has ceased, but we were telling folks, I still think it would be wise to visit with these people about, some of the some of the conditions and that are contained in these conservation agreements. Because, I mean, as in this merger acquisition environment, you may well end up acquiring somebody that's already in a plan, and then maybe you can bolt on some acreage to that. There's some different ways, because again, people are already covered. And I think that the most disgraceful thing about all this is that these conservation plans go much further than any plan that the federal government would come up with.
So what was it about the plan that wasn't good enough that they needed to list the lizard? Was it a distrust of the industry, or I know I'm asking
Um,
you to speculate a little bit, but
I-
it
I'll
does.
have to speculate a little bit, but I do think that one of the arguments that they've made is that these plans are voluntary. Um,
Okay.
uh, they're quote voluntary, although, Grant, if you were to enter into one today, you would have to sign a contract with some term to it. 3 to 5 years. The goal though, is that these plans will last 30 years. And so presumably you'd have to re-enroll every 5 years. And what if you don't? So there's some, I guess you would call that mistrust.
Yeah.
When you would go from such a high level of subscription right now, to somehow or another drop off a precipice, and all of a sudden nobody's doing this
Right.
anymore.
We're
And
just not,
so
not
that's
following
one.
it.
Um, Also, I think they claim that while they don't offer an alternative necessarily, they claim they're not particularly effective. The service claims that these plans, while heavily subscribed, they have not um, sufficiently stopped surface activity, because fragmentation, and that's a key buzzword in the ESA lexicon, fragmentation of the habitat continues. And what that means basically is, well, you had a section and you built a road through the middle of it, and now you fragmented it. And I think it's really insulting to the lizards out there to assume that, because the assumption is, um, uh, the lizard won't be able to travel from subsection A to subsection B because of the roads you built. And we all have seen lizards cross roads before. So it's really ludicrous. And all kidding aside, it's, there's obviously more impactful fragmentation, putting a well pad in and other stationary equipment. Um, but that's precisely the primary argument is fragmentation, the area in question out here in Andrews, a little bit of Ector, Winkler, Leonetti counties, it's so fragmented that it has produced irreparable harm to the species. Now, one of the questions I asked in the first go round back in the uh, 2010 timeframe, and we really started digging into this. And I've asked again, because we've had multiple conversations and multiple meetings with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with
Sure.
Texas Parks and Wildlife, New Mexico Game and Fish, and all of the folks who study um, these species and others. How many lizards exist? Let's get some data points. How many lizards exist right now? Well, the answers were always, well, we don't really know. Well, how many used to exist? Well, we don't really know that either. I said, okay, well, how about what's a sustainable population? Good, healthy population. Well, we don't really know that either. All we know is that the habitat is fragmented beyond repair, and we're in some of our sampling that we've done. And what they do is they'll take a little uh, uh, disposable cups, and they'll set these little traps out in the sand dunes and in little quadrants. And if a lizard happens to go by and fall into one of those cups when they go back the next day or two and pull them, then they get counted. And if they don't happen to walk and fall into a cup, then it's presence absence survey. I mean, I think it's somewhat common in the biological world, but I don't think it's particularly detailed and accurate. That's the most accurate. Those are the studies that they rely on for population. Is that you know, in some of their presence absence surveys in the areas they've tested, the numbers have gone down.
The numbers have gone down, meaning that they
Well, we're
think.
not sure from what to what necessarily, but
I was about to say, if you don't know a starting point, how do you know it's gone down?
you
I'm
get
trying
the
to,
point.
no, okay, I just wanted to make sure I understood
Well,
where you were heading with that.
Well, so it's ludicrous in many respects, and I respect there's some legitimate scientific work that's been done on the habitat and on the species and so forth, and I think I certainly understand that some folks do have legitimate passion for the sand dune lizard and other things that live in these very harsh environments, and I think as an oil and gas industry, our position has always been we don't want to do anything to harm the DSL or any other species. We certainly don't want to cause the demise of any species on our watch, and hence our significant engagement and involvement in these conservation areas. Because what we've tried to do is prove that you can do both. You can protect the habitat and improve the environment while producing oil and gas that we have to keep producing. And so I think most people recognize that, but unfortunately, the service is among them.
So you went back and talked about, well, now an operator or a city that needs a project has to go and get approval, but walk through now that whether it's the DSL or anything else under the ESA, love throwing all these acronyms around, but it's what will that require now? What will the cost be? Uh, time, labor, delays. How how do I calculate that?
Well, if anybody's interested in finding out the real process that they will need to go to because they've discovered they've got assets that they need that they've identified in the habitat, and I also want to come back to just that question of just where is the habitat? But you would reach out, my recommendation would be to reach out to the Region 2 office of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is based in Albuquerque. Find them online. And they and some staff in New Mexico, as well as a couple of the Austin field staff, also have a role in this. And you would try to set up a meeting with those folks, and you would set up your consultation time, and you would go and consult. You'd go in there, and so I think what people tell me that have been through this process is it can take up to a couple of years, and there's no guarantee you'll get approved. So meanwhile, your development plans, your assets are potentially significantly devalued because you really don't know whether or not the risk of moving forward with your project is worth the reward of successful projects. So there are also fees. And I've already mentioned the fines that, if you chose to move ahead and somehow or another, damaged, or killed a lizard, um, you could face significant fines, and including some criminal penalties. So, um, yeah, I think it remains to be seen what the ultimate typical charge will be. The fees that Fish and Wildlife would charge, and for entering into a habitat conservation plan, which is what a post-listing document looks like. Um,
I would
it's
think
it's
usually
also an
some of
interesting
this
question
would,
because most people are already in a conservation plan. So I think a vast majority of people are protected um, from needing to go to those extra consultations. But that's not to say that those conditions, regulatory conditions, couldn't continue to change.
I guess my guess is that the permitting and the dollars that you have to pay pale in comparison to the delay in the actual time to get everything approved and sanctioned. It-
That's exactly right. I mean, I think that's the most obvious thing. It could well be that the, uh, the monetary impacts are huge too. But what you know right off the bat is the time and the uncertainty that creates. I mean, you gonna continue to lay out that section, for a drilling program, for example, when you don't know whether or not you're going to be allowed to, right?
Yeah.
And when time is money, in our business and in every business. But particularly when there's such a dramatically high level of uncertainty on whether or not you're going to be authorized to conduct any activities, it's almost safer to assume that you won't be.
When you want to go back to habitat, but that actually kind of, and I also want to go back to just data because if you don't really know the number of lizards you had or you have, then you probably don't know how many you're going to need to get out of the ESA. It seems like it's a constant. And then, so that's quantity, but then you expand to your point of habitat. If you don't know the data of lizards, how do you know the area that they're living in?
A very good point. One that we've really scratched our head over, and it relates to the habitat. So, for example, um, in real terms, there are three separate habitat maps. One of the, so over the years, um, Texas A&M and others have developed, and the Fish and Wildlife Service themselves have developed different maps. So what they chose to do, and they're legally allowed, the service is legally allowed to take 12 months after a listing to determine critical habitat, kind of the final map. Typically, though, um, there's a much less uncertainty about where the habitat is. It's well defined. It's well understood. Um, in this case, like I said, you've got three different maps. If you're an operator on the landscape, you're looking at three. Am I in or am I out? There's significant overlap with these maps, but they're not identical, and so it's very, very confusing. And I think it calls into question the data. If you
So
don't
has Fish
really
and
know
Wildlife Has Fish and Wildlife identified one of those maps, or is it?
No, they're still determining among the three
Oh, okay.
which is gonna be official. Now, the other thing that we worry about, and we've seen Fish and Wildlife done, which is make the hair on the back of your neck stand up probably, is that while if you've seen any, most people have seen these maps and they're little polygons around in far west Texas, um, where there's very good to not so good habitat, and they're color coded, and um, but what our concern is that in each of the counties where there are some habitat that they will, when they go ahead and finalize critical habitat, they're gonna say the entire county is habitat. Because presumably, uh, it would create a healthier environment, if they had more room to roam. Um, but we already know that it's a habitat specialist that really only likes these sand dunes. We've seen them do that before. We've seen them expand the map well beyond, what is the quote known and scientifically agreed to habitat. So that's a very one of the PVPA isn't going to be and already is involved in working on that, as best we can, working with Fish and Wildlife to help establish that final map and make sure that it doesn't creep unreasonably large. But we're very early in that process.
I've heard of similar type issues, like even up in the Rockies, where with the grouse, that where
Sage grouse, yeah.
there's a area that they're very populated and almost so much too much so, and another area that is having maybe population issues, but everyone gets clumped together. So is that kind of a national thing with the Fish and Wildlife, where they just kind of go larger than smaller?
It certainly appears that way. The sage grouse is another challenging species that spent, a lot of time going back and forth, developing conservation plans, negotiating different aspects of conservation. And then I think, yeah, fortunately for me, I'm not heavily involved in that one. I am involved in a cousin species, um, that is the lesser prairie chicken that does impact the Permian and parts of 5 states. But so the lesser prairie chicken and the greater sage grouse are very similar examples of what's going on with the misuse of the Endangered Species Act. And for example, the mentioned the 5 states in the habitat for lesser prairie chicken. Sage grouse has 11.
Ooh,
I believe it's 11 states, and they're both similar also in the point that you're making. In our example, there's far more birds in Kansas and for lesser prairie chicken, and lo and behold, even into Nebraska and so forth, than there are in Texas. The Similar thing is true at the sage grouse. I think there are far more in Wyoming, perhaps, than there are in some of the more western states. I don't know why that is. Um, so it's a challenge.
I've kind of heard that animals kind of shift every now and then too. So the migration also, it's kind of,
They
that
do. Funny,
might be
funny how
why.
animals and a
Yeah.
lot of times, these birds have wings and
Oh,
they'll fly actually.
see, I
So that's
also
pretty
thought
mobile.
if Fish and
Much more
Wildlife was
mobile than the lizard, Grant.
if Fish and Wildlife was really concerned about the lesser prairie chicken, they might should rename it, because if I was a prairie chicken and I was known as lesser or less prairie, I would feel very insecure. So maybe they should rename it to make it feel a
Well,
little.
it's worse than that, Grant. I think you're onto something, but it's worse than that. There's actually a greater.
See, that's when you start having a pecking order.
Now, you want to know
If
something
chickens
really
is,
interesting, though? I mean, what can you do about this? I don't want to be all doom and gloom. Um, um, on the lesser prairie chicken question, number one, we are challenging this one in court. And we're in the Western District of Texas.
We
We
being
challenge
EPA or we?
EPA
Okay,
is challenging the federal government. Again, we challenged their listing decision in 2012, and we prevailed. So they tried to list in 2012, and we proved to them that they did not, prove to the court that they did not follow their procedures, to make a valid decision, and the court threw it out. Um, our goal is to, be successful again. But with respect to the greater versus lesser question, um, the we have been supportive of some research that state wildlife agencies of, uh, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado have conducted through WAFWA, looking at the genetics of the lesser prairie chicken. And they also looked at some of the genetics of the greater. Come to find out that there were, and these reports should be, these scientific, peer-reviewed reports should be available any day now, but that there is almost no discernible difference between a greater prairie chicken and a lesser prairie chicken, other than so genetic difference. There's almost no genetic difference. They look a little bit different. The graders are a little bit bigger, but it's kind of like, you go down in South Texas and look at a white-tailed deer, and they're pretty big. And then you go up into the hill country and you see white-tailed deer, and they're pretty scrawny a lot of times.
yep.
Certainly, but they're the exact same animal. So anyway, we're that question. That's just gets right to the heart of the matter of how good is their science that they're using. Which kind of leads me to the most recent thing is this Supreme Court case recently.
Yeah, no, that's important. So please.
I don't want to just keep talking. You may want to talk about
No,
something.
I think, and we're running out of time. So I think finishing on this point about the Chevron difference, and I think that's where you're heading, is perfect because it used to be. My understanding is that when in doubt, rely on the federal agency as being the arbiter of goodwill, of facts from both sides. And you could argue that might have has changed. I'll let you make that argument. But through this Supreme Court decision, it's going to materially change how that's perceived.
No question. I think I'm still reviewing the decision and visiting with folks to try to determine what what the impacts, of this decision will be. But I think it's going to be a large impact. And I think Chevron said that courts were to defer with a question of science or fact, but defer to the agency, federal agencies, because the assumption is they have the experts, they have the expertise, they have the resources, and they just should be trusted. Their science, for example, their numbers should be trusted over yours. And so, I mean, because the argument was that's what their job is. And so the Supreme Court overturned that. And it may have made sense to Chevron back in 1984 when they got this ruling. That but it's been abused so many times that in the court you say, well, we have this other science over here that's been done at the universities and it's been peer reviewed and it's validated, but yet you still have agency folks say, no, our uh, our research is better. Um, the courts had up to now been supposed to defer to them, which we're hopeful that this levels the playing field, frankly, because we try to fight. We're engineers, geologists, and in this business, and we try to fight on the science, and we think in most cases we can win on the science if the game is not rigged.
Does this just shift it from these federal agencies to the courthouse then?
Um, I don't think so. I just think what it will do, it will cause the federal agencies to put greater emphasis on uh, professional, sophisticated data analysis and not relying on outdated or substandard material, and it'll allow facts to be compared to facts and not be weighted. And I don't think so. Yes, I think in a sense the courts will get to arbitrate that. We'll see how that plays out in the future. But what I think one of the impacts it's going to have is it's going to cause the agencies to have to take a good hard look when they bring these proposals forward on ESA, on methane, on what have you, that we can't just the court's not required to just accept that the government's data is better.
Yeah, it does sound like it opens the door for at least some additional thought and actions by the industry or other folks. So, well, very good. Well, really appreciate your time. One thing that is perfectly clear of all of this is that uh, there's no way that the Permian Basin Petroleum Association is going to run out of things to do and ways to represent the industry. That it just seems like it keeps getting more complex, and the need for someone providing industry support is going to be more and more, even more vital. But Ben, I really appreciate your time, appreciate what you do, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Grant, and thank you for all you do. These uh, webcasts are really they were a real lifesaver when you started them, and I think they're still great. So thanks for doing it. Thanks for having me.
Very good. Thank you, Ben.
Bye bye.